So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center. Welcome to the virtual reading group. This week we're reading Hannah Arendt's essay on violence. It's one of the few essays, I'm trying to think, one of the very few things that she published twice. She publishes it first, well, actually three times. She published it in the New York Review of Books as a long, long essay in the New York Review of Books. Then in this wonderful book, which we've read before, Crises of the Republic. And then also as a standalone volume in a book called On Violence. Um, to me, this is one of the most important and relevant essays that she wrote. And especially today, I find it deeply resonant with so much that's going on. And that's why we're going to spend 2 weeks on it. And the way I've divided it up in my mind is that today we're going to talk largely about parts 1 and 2, which doesn't mean you can't bring up part 3. And then next Friday we'll talk about part 3, which to me gets to really gets to the heart of a lot of what's going on. Let me give a short introduction. On Violence is an essay that's divided into 3 parts. She divides it into 3 parts. I have named the 3 parts, which is me, not her, so that part 1 I call Violence and its Instruments. Part 2 I call Power. And part 3 is Violence as Separate from Power. You can ignore those if you'd like. How do you make your way into this? Because this is an essay that, again, written for the New York Review of Books originally, and as with so many of Arendt's essays, on the one hand, incredibly precise, and on the other hand, she brings in all sorts of digressions and interesting asides, and so it's sometimes hard to make your way through the whole essay. And so, just as a way of, I hope, orienting us, I'd like to read the last paragraph of the first part, which is on page 132 in this edition and page 31 in this edition, depending on what you're using. And in that last paragraph, she says, "Since we are concerned here primarily with violence, I must warn against a tempting misunderstanding. If we look on history in terms of a continuous chronological process, whose progress, moreover, is inevitable, violence in the shape of war and revolution may appear to constitute the only possible interruption." So just to understand what she's saying in that 2 sentences, look, we're concerned with violence, and there's a tempting misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding, which we can call, as she is going to call it here, in a sense, the Marxist misunderstanding, or the quasi-Marxist misunderstanding, is that the way you interrupt progress, that the world largely goes along progress, or at least some people think so, and she's going to contest that, but the way that progress is interrupted is through violence and war, and that those are the ways that you interrupt and change the progress of society. And then she continues, if this were true, if only the practice of violence would make it possible to interrupt automatic processes in the realm of human affairs, the preachers of violence would have won an important point. And again, a lot of what she's talking about here are the preachers of violence, people who have come to believe that the way to bring about social change is through violence. And much of the essay is written in conversation with and to a certain extent against those preachers of violence. In an aside, she says, theoretically, as far as I know, the point was never made but it seems to me incontestable that the disruptive student activities in the last few years are actually based on this conviction. Um, the conviction being that in order to make change, you need violence. I'm teaching a course right now on the Hong Kong protests that have been going on for the last year in Hong Kong, and one of the things that you hear over and over again from the students, young people who are leading these protests, is that it seems like the only way to get the attention and the only way to make change is through violence. They don't want to do violence, but they're committed potentially to using it. And Arendt is saying there was a similar view amongst the student and anti-war and civil rights protesters in the 60s. And then she concludes this paragraph and part one saying, "It is the function, however, of all action, as distinguished from mere behavior, to interrupt what otherwise would have proceeded automatically and therefore predictably." And so here is, in a sense, the thesis of the whole essay. And I just want to make sure that's out there at the beginning. The thesis is that not only violence can interrupt automatic processes, can make social change, can make political change, but all action can. And action, for those of you who've read some Arendt, know is an important word for Hannah Arendt. It's an important idea. It's going to mean to be free and to act are the same, Arendt says in a number of places. So action means freedom. All freedom as action, as distinguished from behavior, can interrupt automatic processes. What does that mean? It means that it is the human capacity to start something new, to be free, to act in ways that are unexpected. And when people act in ways that are unexpected, whether it's Martin Luther King giving a speech, or whether it's Martin Luther nailing some theses to a church door. When people do things like that are unexpected, that are not mere behavior, that are free, that's what she calls action. And when they do that, they insert a new event into the world, and people start talking about it. And people can talk about it in many ways. They can say, you're a criminal, you should be shot, or you should be hung. Or they can say, you know what? That's really interesting. Let me think about it. And people begin telling stories about it and retelling them and talking about it. And the world, the stories that comprise the factual world, the works, the artworks that make the factual world, the buildings and the institutions that make the factual world shift. They move. And that's what she means by action. And so a lot of what this essay is about, and there's a lot of sides and there's a lot of interesting other parts of it too, is about how do you make change? And there's a thesis that's been out there, which she says is that the only way to make change is really violence. And she's going to contest that thesis. Part one is where she sort of sets the ground for this and talks about the reason and the fact that people are turning towards violence in the protests and the social movements of the 60s. Part two is she's going to make some important theoretical distinctions between some terms, namely power, violence, and authority are the three big ones. And she's going to say that actually it's important to understand the difference between power and violence, because power is going to be where she thinks social change can really happen, not through violence. And then part three is about how we think about power being separate from violence and how we can think about restoring or re-emerging new power structures in the contemporary world. So having said that, I could try and now go back and do a little more, but maybe I'll open it up for some comments or questions, and we can talk about the text, and I'll fill it in as we go along, if that's okay, because I see we have a lot of people on today. Are there questions at this point, or do you want a little bit more of the text presented? Let's see how people feel.
Well, there was an article recently.
Who else? Who was trying to talk?
I was
Bob, you
just
want
going
to?
to say,
Oh, go ahead.
more
Yes.
text would be great.
Who's that?
That was Susan. I was just saying more text would be great if you're up for it.
I'm happy to do it. I never know if you guys want to hear what you guys want to hear. Bob, did you have a particular passage you were interested in, or do you want me to go on a little more?
Yes, this is on my book,
Yeah.
page 28, where she talks about hidden persuaders.
Thank you.
And I read this shortly after reading an article in the New York Review about big data and the ways in which the Internet of Things and everything else is tracking, all of our clicks, all of our preferences, all of our conversations. And so, it occurred to me that what would she think of that? Because she's dismissing the hidden persuaders here, but, business and perhaps government eventually, if not now, thinks that there's a lot to be mined through these means, and it's very, very troubling.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that contradicts, if we accept that all of this big data is effective, contradictory to what she says.
Great.
Roger, I was going to bring up, it's Margaret, I was going to bring up that same section, and just to add a slightly different question to it. I guess looking at that section, and I have wrong written in large letters in the margin next to it because it's just factually would not be a global multi-billion-dollar industry if she was correct. Sorry about that. But my question really is, in that section, and perhaps in the, shall we say, rather ugly section about what she thinks Black students are doing great, to what degree can we analyze her findings by the slip-ups in her analysis? So I would consider what Bob just brought up and, the other section, differentiating by race, as slip-ups, where her analysis, it's not tight. It seems to be loose.
Great. Thanks, Margaret and Bob.
Excuse
So-
me, can I just ask,
Yes.
Roger, maybe you know which page it is in the Crisis of the Republic version?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's helpful. It's going to be the actual citation that Bob was reading from is going to be on page 130 in the Crisis of the Republic
130.
edition.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
So, so let me say that with it, this passage that Bob brought up is in part one of the essay, right? And I'm gonna, if you don't mind, Bob, I'm gonna take the opportunity to do a little bit of contextualization here. So part one of the essay begins with Arendt's attempt to define violent action. Remember, I said that violence for her is a form of action, and it's to be compared with action. So on page 2 of the essay, or page 106 of the Crisis of the Republic version, she'll say the very substance of violent action is ruled by the means end category. Right? Means end category. And so violence for her is a means to an end relationship, and it's largely using instruments to achieve ends, namely violent instruments. And the worry she has at the beginning is that the means, the violence, can overwhelm the ends. And one of the aspects of violence that makes it so hard to work in her minds is the unpervading unpredictability that it brings about. Violence can lead to all sorts of unintended consequences. And one of the dangers she really points to in our time, now she's writing in the late 1960s here, but one of the dangers she points to is one that we've seen her point to over and over again in reading her work, which she calls the danger of intellectuals. And the danger of intellectuals here is the belief that we can control violence, the belief that we can understand and control violence in such a way that we can make it serve our ends. And that we provide theories to justify violence, namely ends to justify the means, that she says put to sleep our common sense and make us lose reality. She then goes to this longer discussion of the shift to glorification of violence by the New Left, which I'll leave for now. And then she says, well, why have we turned to the glorification of violence? And she says that the main reason may be this feeling of coming disaster or doomsday, so please mute your mics if you're on, because I'm hearing someone's phone ring. If your phone ringing, it means your mic's not muted. Someone, thank you. And then she comes to this question, which starts on page 127, at the end of this first section, which is on progress. And this is the part that Bob is asking about. And this is part of her argument against what she calls the dogma or the ideology of progress, the idea that things get better and improve. In the 17th century, she says it was called the accumulation of knowledge. The 18th century thought of it as the education of mankind. And what she's going to say here is that there's this idea that things get better, that the world goes in sort of a predictable, constantly evolving continuum of relationships. And then on page 130, which is where the quote Bob read us appears, she begins and says, I do not need to add that all our experiences in this century, which has constantly confronted us with the totally unexpected, and of course that also means the horrific and the Holocaust and nuclear war and other things, stand in flagrant contradiction to these notions and doctrines, namely of progress, whose very popularity seems to consist in offering a comfortable, speculative, or pseudoscientific refuge from reality. So here she's gearing up to argue that things don't just get better. There's not this sort of progress in society. And she says a student rebellion almost exclusively inspired by moral considerations certainly belongs among the totally unexpected events of the century. One example. This generation, trained like its predecessors, is hardly anything but the various brands of the my share of the pie social and political theories, has taught us a lesson about manipulation, or rather its limits, which we would do well not to forget. And here's the quote Bob read. Men can be, quote, manipulated through physical coercion, torture, or starvation, and their opinions can be arbitrarily formed by deliberate, organized misinformation, but not through hidden persuaders, television, advertising, or any other psychological means in a free society. Alas, refutation of theory through reality has been a lengthy and precarious business. So, what is she saying, and is she wrong, as Margaret has it? What she's saying is, yes, you can manipulate people. You can manipulate them through coercion, torture, starvation, and deliberate and organized misinformation, yes. But what she says is, people have more freedom to resist the hidden persuaders, television, advertising, than we often think. And she gives an example of a police officer who was supposed to be keeping order in People's Park in Berkeley during the protests, and finally said, I can't stand this anymore, and sort of threw down his weapons and put his arms around people. And what she says is, the human capacity to think and be free and to act is always extraordinary and always able to resist um, uh, most efforts at persuasion. People disagree, and there's not going to be generally one view. This ties up with another thing we've talked a lot about in this reading group at times, what she calls the holes of oblivion. She just doesn't think in the end that people can be disappeared and made irrelevant and they'll never be heard from again. She has an incredible faith, maybe misplaced if Margaret thinks so. Yeah, I mean, I get it. That in the end, courageous acts, individual human acts are possible and will be remembered and will be meaningful, which is why she says at the end of this paragraph, which is on 132, progress, in other words, can no longer serve as the standard by which to evaluate the disastrously rapid change process we have let loose. She doesn't think the world goes according to plan. And so when she says that the manipulators and the hidden persuaders are not able to fully function, what she means is there's always going to be unexpected glitches. There's always going to be surprises. There's always going to be human acts of freedom, like a student rebellion motivated by moral considerations. Who would have thunk it, right? Who would have expected it? So that's what I take her to be saying.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Is it possible? Hi, my name's Tara. I'm in Ankara, Turkey, and thank you for having me in your group. So could it also be possible, because I'm thinking of, our current moment with, the influence in the 2016 election, and that she says we require a free society. So one way to reconcile it would be to say our society right now doesn't fit the definition of free, and therefore people are subject to manipulations. That she's imagining a world without Fox News, where there's some sort of balance of information, and that we're beyond the point of that, so that we are actually potentially manipulatable.
I think that's a fair point. But just to say that she first brings up this idea in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, and in that book she raises the question of the camps, the extermination camps, and she says, were these camps holes of oblivion? Were they places where acts of resistance would be futile? Where men were turned into animals, behavioral animals who couldn't act, who couldn't resist, and even to resist was futile because no one would ever know of your resistance. It wouldn't matter. And she sort of takes that a position, honestly, in that book. 12 years later, when she writes Eichmann in Jerusalem, she says there are no holes of oblivion. And that's because what she's learned, or what she thinks she's learned at that point, is that people who did resist, even in camps, even in the most in places where they had no expectation that their resistance would matter or be heard, that resistance was heard and did continue to be talked about and inspire other people across the generations. And so what she says in that book is there are no holes of oblivion. There is no what you would call, Tara, if I understand you correctly, a world of total manipulation. There's always going to be the possibility, and in her mind, the reality, that acts will matter and acts of resistance will matter. They may not matter short term, they may not win short term, but they will have an impact. Now, that's an incredible faith that she has. And I hear what you're saying, and maybe this is what Margaret was saying as well, to be, well, she didn't know the level of technology and the level of manipulation that we would be achieving. And, I think on one hand, clearly she didn't, although I think she sensed a lot of it and she wrote a lot about it. But I think what she has is an incredible faith in the human capacity to resist and to start new things and to act differently, to break up the progress of society.
Can I say something, Roger? Can you
Yeah.
hear me?
I hear you. You're bouncing around, but I think I can hear you.
It's David Bell from London.
Hi, David.
Hi. I feel very torn over this because, first of all, I don't think the fact of the quantitative factor of the forms of surveillance and control that we have now necessarily would make a qualitative difference to Arendt's judgment. I suspect she would say the same thing. Although I think there's a difference between the individual acts and collective acts, like student rebellions, for example. And I think she falls into a trap here, which is the same one as Sartre falls into, of a kind of excessive belief. Although the value of the individual act is to be absolutely treasured and its effects, I think it's kind of utopian as well. That is, that the belief that the individual who transcends his conditions for that moment is dependent upon so many other factors. So Sartre says the worker can sort of be a worker during the day and write poetry in the evening. And of course, some workers do, but the majority are under the cosh of the systemic violence of their own daily life, which robs them of any feeling of the capacity for autonomous action. So I think it rather leaves that out, that there will be certain people who will transcend, but we also need to understand that they are very special people. And we need to understand what it is that stops other people from being able to act. And that's the more kind of hidden kind of systemic violence.
I think that's a fair point, David. So thank you. I think that Arendt, her view on this would be that while there is systemic violence, a word she doesn't use, but while there is a social impetus to stop many people from thinking, I mean, what she will say is that throughout history, the number of people who acted freely and thought freely was always small. And at the end of the book On Revolution, she says it may have even gotten smaller today than it has been in the past. But she doesn't think it's going to ever disappear. And so all I would say in response about your claim about the numbers is that I think she would agree with you. But she would say that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many people act freely and ethically, as long as some do. Because as long as some do, she says, they keep the idea of freedom alive in the world. She speaks at the end of On Revolution of what she calls islands of freedom. And she says, it's never been the case that everyone was free. That's sort of that's a myth it's just never been the case. It never will be the case. But as long as you continue to have islands of freedom and spaces for people to be free, she thinks it will happen. Clearly we can imagine a world in which we are increasingly fitted with devices and inserts or implants that make such human spontaneity and thinking impossible or very difficult. And obviously, to the extent that happens, I think she might revise her claim. But as long as that hasn't happened or doesn't happen, your very good point, and one I'm not disputing, about the increasingly small numbers of people who act freely, I think will not bother her as much as some people might think it should.
Roger, can I add
Can I-
something to respond to the last comment to add a little bit of philosophical context?
Yeah.
And to bring it back to the essay. So, Arendt, I understand, she actually attended some of the first student protests at Columbia when it started. And she's thinking about power and violence in relationship to our political and educational institutions. And the way that she sets up this essay, she is dissecting and taking apart the most common theoretical justifications for the use of political violence. So she dismantles Marx's claim that violence is a necessary part of society's revolutionary birth pains, the coming into being. She's going to take apart Sorel's claim that violence is essentially a creative force and is the mode that's most proper for society's producers, for the working class in particular. And importantly, to the last comment, she's going to take apart Sartre's claim that violence is necessarily essential for man's creation, that violence has to be a part of man doing the work of creating himself. And so she's setting it up this way intentionally, I think, to give us, to undermine these theoretical and philosophical justifications of violence that are being used at this time in these conversations around civil rights for the use of violence and nonviolence in relationship to political action, in order to think how we can act in a way that creates power instead of destroying it.
Thanks, Sam. Someone else said I wanted to speak too.
This is Steve Greenleaf. I have a point. I think you raised an interesting issue, and that is we can imagine freedom in individuals, say somebody in a camp. But the real challenge is for free individuals to gain power. That is, to act in concert, so that mere acts of rebellion or, say, personal communications or even discussions online, such as we're accomplishing here, aren't certainly as meaningful as they could be or should be, unless it is organized into power, into individuals working together in concert to achieve a political end.
That's absolutely right, and that's where we're going to move to in the second and third parts of the essay. But let me let some other people who want to jump in before I move there. But that's a great point, Steve.
One of the things, Roger, is that we have... I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Howard.
Yeah, there are a multitude of protests, for lack of, or at least people advocating a new way of governance or a new way of living, from what's happening in Barcelona to Greece, Latin America, the movements of Latin America. And what's really interesting, and they're a small number when you take the entire population, but what they're doing is they're using YouTube and the internet to send their message. So someone like me, who's totally remote from that, I get constant messages every day because they put up magazines and bulletins, and I subscribe to them, and so in a sense, yes, the number is small and maybe smaller in the past, but the power, using Arendt's understanding of power, of these small groups is probably larger today than ever before in history.
Yeah, and I see a comment. One of the comments is from Ken Crimstein. I don't know if he's on or not, but he says, I think it's a kind of order of magnitude, and lies from political leaders are way more lethal than acts of persuasion in the free market. And I think that's right, Ken. I mean, I don't know if you want to add to that, but I mean, I think where Arendt does say in that passage that Bob was reading on 130, that men can be manipulated, right, through physical coercion, torture, starvation, and their opinions can be arbitrarily formed by deliberate, organized misinformation, right? I mean, I think she's
Hi.
quite aware of that.
Yeah, hi. Nice to see you. Can you hear me? See me?
I do. Nice to see you.
Hi, yeah. How's West End Avenue? Anyways,
We're barricaded, but go ahead.
I think it's an order. I did sort of think it's an order of magnitude. I mean, if you're going to physically, hurt someone, yeah, they'll probably, do what you want. And if you lie to them, if you have politicians and the political space, if you have politicians that lie to you, that's like harm. That's like physical harm. I do think that the data manipulation and all that stuff, you can't deny it, but I think it can change the way things are going. And I think the previous caller said something about certain television networks, which you could say are maybe voices of a type of propaganda. It isn't really the free society that maybe she was referring to. So, I think in her trying to be real, yeah, lies in the political space and physical hurt will definitely make people behave in different ways. So that was my take on it. Although
Yeah.
I do have sympathy for what the person said about data manipulation too. I don't think she could ever even imagine what that was about.
Roger, I'd like to jump in here, going back to something that Sam said. And I'm always looking for as you know, I'm always looking for the historical context. So this book, when I read this book, and this is my third time through, this to me is a conversation with Mark Rudd on her sofa. And she is making an argument against a lot of the theoretics of the SDS movement at that time at Columbia. People were reading Frantz Fanon, who said that people can be persuaded to be their own oppressors, and they're reading Mao, who is saying power emerges from the barrel of a gun, and they take to be true that if there is systemic violence, the only possible response is violence. They take that to be a truism. And I think she's arguing against that. And if you think of it that way, a lot of what she's saying takes on a different character. It's more polemical than philosophical, which is not to put it down in any way. Over time, she persuaded me. So because I was on that side originally, so I had moved from being a pacifist to accepting the power that came out of a gun, and then through her really came to understand the difference. But nevertheless, I think it's important to think about that time and the things that people were talking about at that time. So this passage that we're discussing now was during a period when the situationists were saying, well, okay, there is this fake spectacle, and it's creating a frame of mind that is separating people from their actual existence, and that's a particular argument that was being made at the time, which she is trying to argue against here, saying that no, those advertising and television, who were seen as the enemy by the situationists, right? They are, and which I still see as the enemy, by the way, that they do not have the power that people think they do. I think they do, but that I wanted to put it in that context.
I guess very helpful. Thanks, Jack. Does anyone want to? Yeah, go ahead.
I want to just comment. I was thinking of Giddens' notions of structure and agency, and just ask. It's sort of a naive question, perhaps, but the question of agency changing a structure, does that apply to what Hannah Arendt is talking about to any extent, or is there sort of is a structure always, in a sense, too constricting for for it ever to be resting on justice. In other words, I've just read a bit of Giddens, and what I get from that is that over time, what seems like a structure that's tight and unchangeable actually changes because of the agency of different individuals, and that seems like anyway. I'm just wondering whether in Arendt's philosophy you ever get any kind of new structure, or whether structure in itself is not on her radar as something to be desired. Hope that's clear.
I mean, I don't know Giddens' work, so I'll have to take, from what I understand of your question, which is that Arendt doesn't so much talk about structure, but she does talk about a world. A world is a world of things and of stories and of institutions and of meanings, and the world is that which is composed of the things and the institutions and the stories that connect us, that exist in between us and connect us and hold us together. And yes, she thinks the world can change. Much of her writing is about a great change that happened in the world that starts with the modern world, which she thinks begins somewhere around the birth of science. And so much of her work is an attempt to grapple with how the changes in that modern world are meaningfully impacting what it means to be human, as well as our politics. And insofar as she is asking in this essay, how can we act to change the world? I mean, this essay is, I think, to me, is read in conjunction with the essay coming right before it in this book on civil disobedience. But it's about what are the possibilities to act to change the world, and we're going to get there when we talk about part 3 very much next week. But we can certainly presage it. She's interested in the question of are there ways to create a new political world, or are we so committed to this one and so stuck in it that we can't get out of it? And that's the kind of question she's going to ask at the end of the essay. Yeah.
I have a quick question.
Could I maybe? Oh, I'm sorry.
Someone who said that? I have a quick question.
Oh, me, Rob. It seems that action and the world are very interconnected parts, and I just wanted to understand a little bit better what she means by world. Is it scoped to only a political context where we are able to speak to one another in a public sphere, or is the world something larger I guess if we take the interface of what are all the actions I can do in being in the world, what would Arendt say those actions are? What are the kind of the primitive actions?
Yeah, no, thanks, Rod. It's a good question, and world is, I think, one of the most important ideas in Arendt. It is at its most basic level for her. That comes between each of us, that connects us. So, she gives an example once of people sitting around a table, and you could have different conversations. You could talk here, you could try a seance, whatever it is, but the table is what connects the people. And if you took away the table, there'd just be 8 people sitting with chairs that didn't know what their relation was. the world is like the table. The world is what binds us together. It's what's in between us. Um, in the human condition, she talks about the world within the context of work, right? One of the three main activities of being human: labor, work, and action. And it's in work, where if in labor you largely are seeking simply to keep yourself alive, to live. And you make bread to eat it, you grain to eat it, but it doesn't last, it doesn't stay. But in work, you create houses or parks or institutions or books or theater or novels or poems that last and that become part of a world that people share. And so the third part that she talks about in that book is action. And action is when you do something, as I said earlier, surprising, free, unexpected, not manipulated, not part of the sort of set of progress, but new. And when you act in such a way, your action can be noticed and it can become talked about. And at times, if it's action that really inspires people, inspires stories and institutions that change the world. And so, in a very brief account, I hope that helps make some sense of the relation between world and action. Rob.
Isn't she talking, how does this work? Do you get called on?
Hi, Mary, go ahead.
Hi. Okay. It's the word you didn't use in kind of talking about what she means by world and what she pays attention to as opposed to certain other people, the people she's arguing against particularly, I wonder why you didn't use the word culture, because in some ways, ritual practices, arts, it's how it is or what makes the between people. And so then if you're the emphasis on nonviolence or what creates the conditions for nonviolence, it has to do with paying attention to that, doesn't it? Or valuing that.
Can you just say one or two more sentences? I think I have a sense of what you're after, but just maybe one or two more sentences would help.
Well, it seems to me like there's some of this is sometimes, it's what she sees and what she means by the world and what she thinks about when she's trying to get a hold of basically she's speaking against or writing against the turn toward violence of the new left in part, right? The romanticization of violence or the assumption that real change can only be brought about by violence. Mm-hmm. And, the idea there is also the idea of a revolutionary, which indirectly she also speaks against that or critiques a certain idea when she critiques Thoreau and the individual versus collective action and, what that means. But she's trying, but there's also this idea in all of that of the romance of the revolutionary, or what is it that happens when you transform yourself, or the necessity of revolution. And so then we have to, and that has to be formed in the crucible of violence. And that's true, or it's believed, or it was believed by third world liberation struggles and the various offshoots of SDS. And so then it's a requirement almost, and it's a requirement to personally perpetuate it, to go through it. It's a crucible that you have to experience in order to become, a revolutionary, a true agent of change. I think that's what I'm trying to.
Okay, great. Yeah, culture is a word she doesn't use so much. She has an essay that she has called The Crisis in Culture. And in that essay, she divides it into two parts. One is art and one is politics. And both art and politics can, in a sense, make and revolutionize or remake the world as she understands it in different ways.
Can you say again where she talks about that? Can you just say again where she talks about that?
It's in an essay called "The Crisis in Culture,"
okay.
Which is in the book Between Past and Future.
All right.
And and so for her, yes, I mean the question of revolution, of refounding, of changing the world, um, is an essential one. And as you I think rightly said, Mary, if I understood it, uh, one that she wants to separate from violence.
Yes,
And I think this is what Sam was talking about as well, and what I tried to say when I started, when I said, you know, in many ways, the argument of this essay is that social change, there's a thesis, a tempting thesis, that social change needs violence. And she's going to try to make the argument that that's not the case. And if it's all right with you guys, I'm going to use that as a transition to part 2 of the essay, which is where she.
Roger, can I just interrupt you for a second? Because there are like 3 really good questions in the chat box on what you were just talking about.
Yeah, please.
And maybe you want to address them.
Great. Do you want? Well, or can you point them out?
I can read them to you, but they're really good questions on what we were talking about. So, let's see. Valerie. Where is it? So Ken, I'm curious to see and hear how she reconciles persuasive speech in public space and action power as the essay develops. And then Peter added, is long-term nonviolent resistance a luxury not available to or logical for the most injured by the present moment power structure, even though it might be more successful long-term? Does the future societal health take precedence over the real people who are suffering to the point of possibly dying at the hands of injustice now? And I think,
Yeah, those are great questions. I'm going to try and answer Peter's, and maybe Ken's will come through that. So Peter, I just was teaching Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail this week to my class on protest and revolution, and one of the great themes of that essay is that King says that in many ways the white moderate is more dangerous than the white racist, because the white moderate, seems to be on your side, but keeps saying wait, and at some point, for people who've waited for so long, that is the most frustrating and objectionable stance. And so I take that in some way to be related to your question: is the long-term nonviolent resistance a luxury not available to or logical for the most injured by the present power structure? Does the future societal health take precedence over the real people who are suffering? And I think that's an excellent question. I think you can even frame the question, if you don't mind my doing so, within the context of what we're all suffering through right now with the coronavirus or COVID-19. I was recording a podcast last night with Uday Mehta, who some of you probably know, and he said, take it for granted that in India 1 million people will die. It's possible. And he said about 1 million people died in World War II in all the countries. And yet the world survived it and went on. And I take him to be, he was talking about how Gandhi might respond. And I take the point to be that there's one way of seeing tragedy, things like this, in what's called a tragic perspective or something like that, where you say, look, the world is full of tragedy, and it's maybe more important to keep freedom and keep people working and keep people engaged in the world, and accept that 1 million people are going to die, but let them visit their relatives in the hospital, let them continue to practice their religion, and move on. And the other side is, that's all well and good for the people who are going to live, but the people who are going to die, who are often the poorer and less privileged people, that's not really very helpful for. And I think that's the question that you've raised, Peter. And I don't think there's an answer to it. I think what Arendt offers is not an answer, but thought. And one thing she'll say is, it's tempting to want to solve the problems quickly, or it's tempting to want to prevent the tragedy. It's tempting to want to employ all the means we can to stop death, to end racial or other segregations or racisms and anti-Semitism. And yet, one thing to know is that the consequences of using violent or extreme means to do so are always unpredictable, and that while violence can sometimes work, and we'll get into this when we get into the third section of the essay, she'll say, look, violence sometimes works, and there are times when violence is justified. She's going to say that, so she's not a pacifist. She's not someone who rejects all violence. But what she does say is that while violence sometimes will work for the better, in most cases, the only thing it leads to is more violence. And that's her analysis. That doesn't mean you should never try it. She does want to say, and maybe it's worth taking a look at it, she does want to say that there are times when violence is really important. Where does she say that? Where she talks about how violence can make us aware of injustice.
Begins in the third part, no?
It's in the third
Maybe
part.
It's the second time that she mentions it.
Well, I'd have to find it, but she says violence can sometimes serve justice insofar as it makes us aware of injustice, and that's an important use of violence. It's on page 160 in the Crisis the Republic edition. It's in part 3.
He says it about the students and about the student riots, and also about the Colombian riots.
Yeah,
that she was on their side.
Yeah, and she says, sometimes violence can make us aware of injustice, and the resort to violence when confronted with outrageous events or conditions is enormously tempting because of its inherent immediacy and swiftness. To act with deliberate speed goes against the grain and rage of rage and violence. But this does not make them irrational. She doesn't want to say that violence is always irrational. Right? On the contrary, in private as well as in public life, there are situations in which the very swiftness of a violent act may be the only appropriate remedy. The point is that under certain circumstances, violence is the only way to set the scales of justice right again. So she is quite aware that there are times when violence is important and maybe even the only appropriate remedy for injustice. But she's also aware that in most cases, the response to violence will not be justice, but more violence. And that's her worry. I don't know, Peter and Ken, does that in any way answer or respond to your questions, your comments?
I appreciate the words you said, and look, it's a hard quandary. It goes both ways, and much of the time we're talking here is this back and forth that I'm feeling between yes and no. Yes, violence can't but lead to more violence, At the same time, I guess it depends what violence means, and I could see violence against property distinguished from violence against a person. Violence against property seems much more reparable, and at the same time may cause greater impact in some ways than violence against a person in a injustice that's based on economic injustice.
Okay, great.
Do you think there's a kind of
Could I raise,
problem in using the word violence?
I'm sorry, say that again, David. There's a kind of what in using the word violence?
Well, what we really need is a kind of phenomenology of violence. That the word violence is a portmanteau for so many different kinds of human action. That maybe she's gesturing a bit towards discriminating different kinds of violence. And of course, it can never be absolute. There can never be a classification, but there are different dimensions within it. And the tendency to talk in terms of violence as one thing is very problematic in itself. And I think that's what Peter's, we saw on the television last night, policemen in India spraying the fleeing migrant workers with disinfectant. Well, that's a very different kind of violence from the violence of those workers who rebel against their oppression and try to fight the policemen.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you say that you need a phenomenology of violence is great, and there have been some who work on that. Arendt is trying to bring some less a phenomenology of violence, I would have to say here, although often she does work phenomenologically. Here, she's trying to bring some conceptual clarity to the idea of violence. I wonder if people agree with that claim, but the reason I make it is that in part 2 of the essay, which I'm going to at least try and get to now briefly so that we can at least have talked about it, the argument here in part 2 is that how do we think about violence in the political realm? And what she says is that the mainstream tradition in which that happens sees violence as simply a powerful form of power or an extreme form of power. And she cites a number of political thinkers along these lines. So Max Weber, who says that the rule of men over men is based on the means of legitimate, that is allegedly legitimate violence. So governmental rule, power, is based in legitimate violence. And C. Wright Mills writes, all politics is a struggle for power. The ultimate kind of power is violence. Marx, as you know, sees the state as an instrument of oppression in the hands of the ruling class. Alexander Passerin d'Entrèves says that for him, even though he has some more nuance for Arendt, power is qualified or institutionalized force. It is a kind of mitigated violence. And Arendt sees all of these thinkers as part of a tradition that equates or collapses power and violence. But she says there's another tradition, one in which, from the Greek idea of isonomy, or the Roman idea of civitas, in which power is not simply about violence or command or obedience, but is a manifestation of collective power, what she's going to call the capacity to act in concert. And this idea of power, of acting together in concert, is what she's going to try and separate out from violence conceptually, as a conceptually different idea. Now, it's important for us to recognize that with so many of her conceptual distinctions, they're not absolute, right? She's going to be very clear that there's no such thing as pure power, and there's no such thing as pure violence. She'll say at 149, no government exclusively based on the means of violence has ever existed. And I think she'll also say that there's no government purely based in power. But she wants to make these distinctions. And so in part 2, on page 143, she'll define power as the capacity not just to act, but to act in concert. So if freedom and acting are the same, as she will say over and over again, power is the capacity, the ability to act freely with others. And when you act freely with others, you enter the world, this common world that's in between us, and you impact it. You do things, you act in such a way that people have to respond. And that's going to change the world. And for her, that idea of acting in concert is really what it means to found a new world, to revolutionize the world, to the extent that your action is taken up by others and becomes becomes integrated into the world. She distinguishes that power, that free action in concert with others, from violence, also from authority. Authority is the unquestioning recognition that we have for certain authorities. But the main point is to distinguish power from violence. Violence is instrumental. It's always means ends oriented. Power for her is not instrumental. It needs no justification. So, to use an example that she uses a lot in the American Revolution, the power came not from some end that the revolutionaries were aiming for. It came from the experience of acting together. And in that experience of acting together, they created a world, a new world, that appeared and came to have authority. But it didn't come because of some theory that the violence was mobilized towards. And so much of part 2 is an attempt to make this distinction stick between violence and power. She'll say, for example, that Gandhi, right, mobilized an enormously powerful movement with his satyagrahas and other techniques, and that was power. But in the end, it could succeed because it didn't run up against an enemy that was willing to use unlimited violence, right? Massacre and submission. Yes, there was some, but in the end, in the end, he could win because power could overturn violence. And she thinks usually power will overturn violence. The major exception is when the people employing violence, the governments employing violence, are willing to do anything. And even then, they need some people to help them to massacre and subordinate the people, unless they have a robot army. And she'll actually raise the problem of the robot army here. And she'll say that the only way that violence can really overwhelm power, if there's no power in the ruling government, is to employ a robot army. But otherwise, it's never absolute. There's always some violence connected to some power, and vice versa. I'll stop there. I just want to make sure I got that distinction between power and violence out today. Are there any thoughts or questions, conversations?
Roger, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I wanted to get back to something point you raised way at the beginning, which was what is common about violence and we'll call it power is that they're both actions. And in the human condition, I wish you would have spent more time on it, is the nature around the issue of the nature of action is a certain degree of unpredictability and uncontrollability. I think those are the words that she uses. She spends a limited amount of time on this notion of, therefore, the notion of forgiveness has to be considered. And so she doesn't, at least to my knowledge, doesn't expand upon forgiveness. But I want to pose this question to you and the group from an Arendtian point of view. Is there a limit to the degree of forgiveness that she would argue is necessary given the nature of action?
Yes. So thank you, Frank. So I've written a large amount on her idea of forgiveness. So I'll see what I can do here. Forgiveness is at times used distinct from and sometimes synonymously with another word in her work called reconciliation. And in the end, while it's never fully clear, forgiveness is for smaller things for her, for small, what she calls transgressions, whereas larger crimes require the question of reconciliation, or what she'll then call non-reconciliation. And so, as she says in one text, there is a sublime limit between what can be reconciled with and what cannot be. And I take that to be your question. So yes, what she will say is there are some things that happen that we think are wrong or we don't like, but we reconcile with the fact that they happen and that they're part of the world. And there's a way in which sometimes we forgive them, but forgiveness is a more we actually forgive the person. We say, I forgive you. But she says there are even worse things where we might not forgive the person, but we reconcile with the fact that it happened, and we think we can still live in a world with the people who did it, even if we don't forgive them subjectively. But then there are some things, she says, we simply can't reconcile with. And for example, the Holocaust. And that's why people who were involved in it had to die, as we've been talking about with Eichmann, which we just finished reading last week. And so she does set a limit on reconciliation and to some extent, therefore, forgiveness, if that helps.
Yeah, it is very helpful. Thank you.
So, Roger, then that can I say something? So the idea of unprecedented in our previous in Eichmann in Eichmann's case and in the actions of the Holocaust is really connected to this in terms of let's say classifying the kinds of acts that would make it impossible to want that person to coexist with the rest of us. Is that the case?
Yes, she certainly thought that in order to in any way encounter the reality of Eichmann and what he did, you had to experience and acknowledge the unprecedented nature of both him, but more importantly, what happened, the Holocaust, and that to judge him meant really for her. Again, she never says this, so this is my reading of her, and I just want to be honest and clear about that. But I feel pretty strongly about it. What I think she says that to judge Eichmann and the judgment she issues at the end of the book, the epilogue. The question she asks herself is, can I reconcile myself to a world in which things like this happened and people like Eichmann, even though they may have been not evil in the sense of Iago, but evil in the sense of banal, would continue to exist? And her answer is no, I can't reconcile to living in such a world. And therefore, not because Eichmann deserves it morally, but because I have to announce, and we have to announce, our unwillingness to live in a world in which people who do what Eichmann do can continue to be part of our world. We have to announce our non-reconciliation, our unwillingness to accept that in order to still live in a world we think of as human. He has to die. And so that's what I take to be her argument at the end of the book, which many of us have been reading, so this should be familiar to those of us who've been talking about it. Trying to catch up with some of the comments, but are there questions?
Just wanted to point out that at the end of part 2, she claims she summarizes by saying that violence appears where power is in jeopardy, and concludes that violence can destroy power. It is utterly incapable of creating it.
Exactly. This is on where is this? Yeah, it's on page 155 in the edition from the Crisis of the Republic. It's the last paragraph of part 2. So, I think we can all understand that now. Violence appears where power is in jeopardy. We haven't really talked about that today, but it's something that's come up before. Violence, she says, appears where there's what she calls a revolutionary situation, a situation in which power has been delegitimized. When power has lost its sense of collective action and of agreement. So this brings us back to the idea that I mentioned earlier, that power is based on numbers. Power is not something based in strength or violence. It's based in groups of people collectively acting. And when people stop acting and stop supporting the regime freely, or the government freely, or any organization freely, that's when the government has to either use violence to get its will or fall apart. And so violence appears, she says, power and violence are opposites, where the one rules absolutely, the other is absent. Violence appears where power is in jeopardy, but left to its own course, it ends in power's disappearance. So when power is in jeopardy, the government can either use violence to make up for its loss in power, but if it does so, it will further alienate the people and further thus decrease its power, and it ends in power's disappearance. And then, as Jack also wrote, violence can destroy power, but it cannot create it. Through violence, you will never create truly powerful institutions based on collective action.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah. Hi, Tara.
Isn't that then, doubling back to the beginning, like her big critique of Marx, that we don't have to think of the state as a monopoly of violence, right? This is her very optimistic idea of the state, right? That law is not something that is backed up by violence in the tool of the ruling class, or even Benjamin, who sees violence as founding law.
Yeah, I think you're saying that goes back to her idea that we can have an idea of rule that's not based on violence. Is that your question?
Right.
Or your point?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
That's correct. That is I think what she's here talking about.
Which is
there's
really...
an aside at the beginning. It's in a long parentheses, right, on page 107 to 108, where she's talking about how war is still a final arbiter and violence is still part of the world. And she says it's not likely that any substitute will appear as long as national independence, freedom from foreign rule, and the sovereignty of the state, namely the claim to unchecked, unlimited power in foreign affairs, are identified. And so she's saying as long as the state is imagined as a sovereign state that has control over its own people, and then can do what it wants in foreign affairs as well, you're not going to get rid of violence. What she then says is, in this long parentheses on page 107 to 108, she brings up the example of the United States of America, where she says it's one of the few examples, or few countries, where you can actually separate freedom and sovereignty, at least theoretically. And this goes back to her reading in On Revolution of the United States, again, at its origin and theoretically, although certainly no longer, as a place in which there was no sovereignty, there was no government at the top. It was a series of contested and contradictory power structures in a federalist structure that for her allowed power to be the way to prevent and contest other powers, but with no sovereign at the top who would wield violence to suppress the other powers. And that's her understanding of the United States and of a potentially non-sovereign and thus free country or state.
Yeah.
I have a question about the last remark.
Yep.
So I'm not so versed in American history, but I have maybe this notion that that the United States sort of became more maybe imperial, if I might say so, as a consequence or following World War II. You can maybe when I finish, you can correct everything that I say that is wrong. And then here, I know that, pre-World War One, there was this, what's the word, isolationist, like non-involvement policy in the United States. Like we don't care or we don't get involved with the problems of the world. And well, after World War II, it's very different. Like it seems like the fingers of the United States are everywhere. And this is the point that I don't know, but I would postulate that somehow maybe the involvement in the war made the United States more centralized, because now it needs to go out to the world with armies and so on, and you cannot do it on a federalist, but you have to centralize power. And then this is somehow makes me think about the notion that you cannot create power through violence, but here we have this violent effort that so it was teleological, so what's the word, aim driven. There's a war to participate in, and we're done, but then once we're done, we kind of consolidated.
No, that's a great point, Mark. Arendt certainly thinks that the United States has ceased to be a federalist republic and become a nation state. Where precisely that happened and when is a bit complicated, but certainly there are three stages of it that at least most of us who study this would say. The first is in the late 19th century, with the beginning of federal agencies. The second is during Woodrow Wilson's tenure, and especially during World War I, where a number of things were nationalized. And then the third, I think you're right, would be during and after World War II with the nationalization of the roads, commerce, the armies, and the general security apparatus. If you want to see Arendt writing about this, Samantha, maybe you can remind me. It's either the second or third. It's the preface to either the second or the third edition of the Origins of Totalitarianism, where she has a long section about the rise of the security apparatus in the United States, and how that led to the nationalization of the country and the rise of America as an imperialist country. It's worth reading. I can't remember.
Yeah, it's in Origins of Totalitarianism, and I think it's, I think you're thinking about the chapter on the Jews, the nation state, and the birth of anti-Semitism.
No, I'm talking about one of the prefaces she writes. So she wrote 3 prefaces to the Origins, and this is the preface. I think the second or third preface.
But are you thinking about the preface to the individual sections, or are you thinking about the prefaces at the beginning?
Well, in the edition that I have, they're all at the beginning.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
But,
they're not in mine.
I'm not sure. But it's in the preface, and so if you look for one of the prefaces to the imperialism chapter, you'll see it, and I think it's that would be one place to look, Mark, for that kind of information.
That's in the origins of
totalitarianism, but not in the first edition. You'd have to go into one of the more recent editions.
Thank you.
Are there any questions? We have like 1 or 2 minutes left. I haven't had a chance to scan through. Does anyone want to elevate their question to the last question that's in here?
Hey, I would like to ask something, but it's about the relationship between comprehension and, how my question is, how can we understand this violent landscape? I don't know.
How we can understand
societies.
I'm sorry, can you say that again? How can we understand what?
By the violence in history.
Violence in history?
Yeah, got it.
How can we understand violence in history? Can you by that you mean violence in history or violence as doing? What do you mean by violence in history?
Yeah, it's more like how can we how can we understand violence in our context now? How can we make sense to that? I don't know, because sometimes for Arendt it's so important, the concept of comprehension, but I'm not pretty sure how can we understand it. How can we how can we in all these contexts by COVID, by wars and all that stuff, how can we really make sense to that? So it sounds so weird. I don't know.
Okay, great. That's a big question, and I think in many ways that's what the essay is about. So on one level, she wants to say that across history, violence is about implements, about the means, and how it's using means to pursue ends. And as the means have gotten bigger and bigger, more violent with nuclear weapons and other sorts of things, we have increasingly seen that it's harder and harder to justify violence, and yet still people are. And we have this glorification of violence, even as violence is getting more and more deadly and more disastrous. In the third part, which we'll talk about next week, and she really wants to talk about the question I think you're asking, which is how do we understand violence today? And she's going to say that the reason she's got stuff this is my intro for next week, right? If violence is so bad and so more devastating today than it ever has been, because we have more and more weapons and more terrible technologies that will really, destroy people. If it's so bad, why are people today glorifying it? why are people increasingly turning to violence, even though they know how dangerous violence is? And the answer she's going to give, and so here's your preview of next week. The answer she's going to give is because our political systems have so failed, and the power within them has so atrophied, that people no longer believe they have any other choice. They look at the world and they say, it's corrupt, it's unequal, it's unjust, it's wrong. How can I change it? And the answer is, if I try, if I vote, it doesn't work. If I, sign petitions, if I do civil disobedience, nothing seems to work. And so what she says is, violence is the expression of an incredible frustration of powerlessness and disenfranchisement. And that's why people are turning to violence. So that's what we'll be talking about a week from today. If you have a chance, if you have this book, in addition to reading On Violence, just read the little interview at the end called Thoughts on Politics and Revolution. We'll bring that in as well, but we'll focus on part 3 and on that essay for next week. And as I said, for those of you who came in a little late, I think that our next book is going to be Men in Dark Times. I saw mostly positive reactions to that in the texts. If you have other thoughts and you really want to have us do something else, let me know.
Roger,
But
does
that was
Oblong, does Oblong books still work in this time? Can they send copies of that? Because where I live, I have no access to books.
That's a great question.
In time.
Yes, Daphne, I can confirm that they have digitized their website and they are open for orders. So, we get a discount through the Arendt Center, and it's great to support a local bookstore.
Yep. So if you look at the emails that we send you, it says how you can get a discount, I believe. And you can order through Oblong, or you can order through any. There's also a new independent bookstore website called Bookstore, I believe. Or however you get your books. And that will be from 2 weeks from today. We'll start Men in Dark Times.
Roger, what is the book that you keep holding up that has this violence in it?
Well, this is
that
the
has
book,
the other
Crises
essays?
of the Republic. Crises of the Republic.
Okay.
This is one of the 2 places that the essay was published. It's also
Okay.
published separately in a book on violence.
But the essay that you're mentioning that we should read, is it only found there?
The interview, Thoughts on Politics and Revolution, it's published in a number of places. It's also published in a little volume called Arendt's Last Interviews. And it's also, I'm pretty sure you can find it online.
I just posted a link to it in our chat box. It was published in 1971 in the New York Review of Books.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So yeah, you can get that there as well.
I was able to download the whole book free online. Just look.
Yeah, I'm not gonna talk about that, but yes, you can.
I know why. I understand.
Which book?
You can probably find this book online and download it if you want.
Oh wow!
But
that's what I meant.
I'm in favor of bookstores, and I can't recommend that. But yes. So look, we had a great group today. A lot of new people. Welcome. It's over. Thank you all. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. But I'm happy. I want to stay on for a couple minutes if people want. Happy to hear comments on the group, how we can do it, how we can serve you guys, and what's going well, and what you have worries about. So if you
it's a great session, Roger.
Thank you. Thanks, Pat.
Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. Thanks, Samantha.
Thank you, guys.
Hey, Roger, Scott McLean. Could you? Roger Scott here. How you doing?
Good.
Could you send a link to the podcast you were talking about? You were on last night or this morning. Is there a way that we can access that, or is that part of the podcast through the Arendt Center?
So there have been a couple podcasts. By the way, Samantha and I did a conversation that she posted online yesterday, which is accessible on I don't know where, on YouTube if you search for her and I.
Okay.
The one that I mentioned that I recorded last night is not up yet. We're going to be starting a series of podcasts talking with people about what's going on in the world right now through Hannah Arendt, and I hope it'll launch next week. So I'll keep you posted.
Roger, not to go off on too big of a tangent, but what interested me about what you said about that podcast was, I think last week we were talking a little bit about the situation on the ground with seniors, and I think I mentioned my 96-year-old grandmother who's in a nursing home in Greensboro, North Carolina, and wouldn't you know it, the next day they got their first case of COVID in the nursing home. The next day after that, she felt what she thought was symptoms. They took her to the hospital. She was there they didn't admit her, but she was there for many hours. They said she didn't have COVID. She came back, and 2 days later, same type of thing where she had high blood pressure. She went in, and now she's back at the home again. But I guess my story is my sister just said to me yesterday, she goes, we're never going to see our grandmother again, and she's never going to see anybody else besides a doctor or a nurse behind a mask. Because, even if she was relatively healthy at 96 years of age, her chances of living a year, even in a healthy state, are, she's 96. But the thing is those are the distinctions that we have to come to terms with. Is my grandmother, there's a good likelihood she is never, and she's starting to she's not she doesn't have dementia, but this is all really confusing to her because she's 96. That's just something to think about. My grandmother, we may never see our.
I'm really sorry about that, Scott. But this is a lot of what Uday and I talked about last night, and will come out on the podcast. We're hoping to have it launch Wednesday. So
you get sorry, I didn't mean to go off, but that's what
the
appealed to me about
newsletter, so you'll be advised of it. Okay.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
But I think the point is, I said on the podcast, if my kid or my grandmother or my mother were sick, I wouldn't care. I would go see them. I don't care. That's my view, but I understand people disagree.
Hey, Roger.
Yeah.
This is a completely different tack, so I apologize, Scott. But what you guys have been producing as far as podcasts and YouTube.
Jason, I'm losing you. I don't know.
Okay. Can we get a Slack channel or something?
Could you turn your video off so I could hear you maybe better?
Let's try that. Is that better?
Yeah, let's try it.
Okay. Yeah, I've been watching some of your guys' interviews and whatnot in past discussion groups, and I've been really wanting to engage on some of the past information. And I thought, I know it's a terrible burden, but if you could identify a PhD candidate or someone who can assemble a Slack area or something where we can have a general conversation about those podcasts as they come out, that would be really valuable.
So I believe Samantha has done something like this with her talk recently. I haven't done anything like that. I've never used Slack. I shouldn't say that. A number of years ago, we tried to use Slack in conjunction with this reading group. I don't know if anyone remembers it, but we couldn't do it. It was too expensive, and people didn't make sense. I don't know. Jason, if you're interested in, I don't know if you know technically how to do that, or Samantha. We could certainly set up what's it called? Live chatting sessions where people ask questions.
Can I ask
Yeah.
a little? I think he just jumped off, but I just want to say my dad has joined our virtual reading group, and he enjoyed the session today. So
That's so great.
yes, we're spending time together in quarantine, but if he's there, hi Dad. And so Jason, but what are you imagining? Because this could be done a couple of different ways, you know. So we have a YouTube channel for the Hannah Arendt Center on Facebook, and we'll have a podcast channel. Do you just want a forum space for all of the members who join, who are Hannah Arendt Center members who are listening to the podcast and participating in the virtual reading group to like go and chat with each other? Because I mean, we can easily set up a space like that where we can also post the links to the media. Or are you thinking about having a curated conversation with Roger or myself or other people?
It's more along the line. I was actually watching your interview that you posted earlier this week, and thought, boy, I have all kinds of stuff I could throw at this. But then I thought, boy, I mean, there's like 4 of us have watched this, and I'm like, okay. You know, there's so many more people just here tonight that I would adore having more input. And I know that steals some of the thunder away from the YouTube channels, but having a place that we can actually have the forum, to actually have that central space. You guys were even talking about the question of what is the space that we're offering, and I'm like, okay, let's tackle that.
So if we if we set a time, Scott.
Sam, I don't know if this is an option or if you and Roger can comment on it. One of the weeks that we had off, you know, last month when there was a week off, I accidentally thought that we were on, and I got on Blue Jeans. And I entered in, and it said you entered the room, and I just, you know, stood there, and all of a sudden it was like 3 minutes till, and I'm like, oh, we must not have a class this week. So I don't know how the Blue Jeans works, but if that space is open for scheduling other events, I don't know how that works. I just know that, like I said, I accidentally got on one of the Fridays that we had off, and it allowed me on, and it said you've joined the group. So I don't know.
So we can, I mean, so there are 2 different things there, and Roger, you know, one maybe from Jason, what I hear you're saying is you would like us to just have an open session where it's more of a conversation Q&A. We're not reading anything. You guys have already listened to stuff or watched videos, and you have questions and you want to talk, and there are follow-up things, and we can do that in a Blue Jeans space or, you know, set a time for that. You know, the other would be to just have an open kind of space, which is what Scott is talking about, where you guys can go and hang out together, not necessarily with us to talk as well.
Just so I understand.
There's also some. I want to clarify. I'm just thinking about a ongoing kind of message board type of space as opposed to a live situation.
Yeah.
I think we can create a thing where people can in some way make comments and ask questions that are visible to everybody. And then at certain times, live, Sam or I or someone else can answer, you know, respond to those questions and create a conversation in a chat room. I think that's what you're talking about. Or are you talking about live online? Or both, or
not live,
No, so it sounds like we should set up a hack Slack, and we can just send an invitation to all of our members, and that way you can create conversation threads. We can post media in there. You can share article ideas. You can ask questions, and then Roger and I can check on it, and you know we can respond and post things and engage in that way.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, that's easy to do. Roger, I'll set one up, and you can send the email if you want.
All right. Let's just talk. You and I. I'm sorry. We don't have to do this with everybody, but we should talk about where we're going to set it up and how we're going to put it on the website.
Yeah.
Listen, guys. Thank you all very much. This was a great conversation. A lot of new people. See you next week.